Hey everyone, it's Mr. Phantom Knight, and today I've got a spine-chilling story for you from a Reddit user who goes by the name DobbiesXZ. This one really gets under your skin, so make sure you're in a safe place before we dive in. I used to visit my cousins in London all the time when I was younger. Their house, nestled in an old, quiet neighborhood, was a place of excitement and mystery for me. It was the kind of place where the walls seemed to hold secrets, and the creaky floors whispered stories of the past. The house itself was a relic, an ancient structure with a history that I could almost feel every time I stepped through the door. The wood was dark and worn, the windows were tall and narrow, and every room had a slightly musty scent that reminded me of old books and forgotten memories. To a kid like me, it was an adventure waiting to happen. The trips to London were something I always looked forward to, not just for the change of scenery, but for the chance to bond with my cousins. We'd spend hours exploring every nook and cranny of that old house, imagining we were knights in a castle or detectives solving a mystery. My cousins were like siblings to me, and those trips were filled with laughter, games, and the kind of fun that only children can create in their imaginations. But there was one time that changed everything for me. I was about 10 years old when I came down with a nasty cold, just before one of our planned trips. I remember feeling utterly miserable, both because of the illness and because I was going to miss out on all the fun. My parents decided it was best to leave me behind with my grandmother while they made the trip to London without me. It was only supposed to be for a couple of days, just long enough for me to get better, and then my mom promised she'd take me to join everyone else. The house felt eerily quiet that weekend. Without the usual chaos of packing and the excitement of a trip, the silence seemed to stretch on forever. My grandmother, bless her, did her best to cheer me up with warm soup and stories, but I couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. I was stuck at home, missing out on all the adventures my cousins were undoubtedly having without me. When my mom came back after the weekend, I could tell right away that something was off. She wasn't her usual cheerful self. Her smile, which usually greeted me with warmth, seemed strained, and there was a tightness around her eyes that I hadn't seen before. I was still young, but even I could sense that something had happened, something that she didn't want to talk about. The drive home was quiet. My dad had stayed behind in London for work, so it was just me and my mum. I asked her how the trip was, but she gave me vague answers, her mind clearly elsewhere. That's when I knew something was wrong. My mum was never one to keep things from me, but this time, it felt like she was deliberately trying to hide something. Later that evening, as I was lying in bed, I heard her talking to my dad on the phone. She was trying to keep her voice low, but I was always a curious kid, so I snuck closer to listen. I remember the chill that settled into my bones when I heard her say, "There was a little girl." But she wasn't there. My dad's voice was tense, even though I couldn't hear his exact words. He asked her to explain, and she took a shaky breath before recounting the incident. Apparently, my older cousin had been standing in the living room with my mum and aunt, just chatting as they usually did. The room was cozy, filled with the soft glow of the afternoon sun streaming through the tall, narrow windows. They were probably talking about mundane things, life, work, maybe even reminiscing about when they were kids. My cousin, who had always been a bit of a joker, suddenly got this weird look on her face. She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing as she looked past my mum and aunt, focusing on something or someone behind them. My mum noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. My cousin hesitated for a moment before pointing and saying, "Who's that little girl standing next to you?" The room fell silent. My aunt, who had been laughing just a moment before, turned to look where my cousin was pointing, but there was no one there. Just the three of them in an empty room. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the once warm sunlight now feeling oppressive, as if the shadows were lengthening and closing in around them. They checked the house, thinking maybe it was one of the neighbor's kids who had somehow wandered in. But after searching every room, closet, and corner, they found nothing. No little girl, no signs of anyone else having been there. The house was as it always was, old, creaky, and filled with silence. The rest of the weekend passed without incident, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. My mom said she felt uneasy, like they were being watched, but she tried to brush it off as her imagination. She didn't want to scare my cousin, who seemed unbothered by the whole thing, even joking that maybe they'd seen a ghost. But that wasn't the only strange occurrence that happened at my aunt and uncle's house. A few months later, I finally got to visit them again. By then, the memory of what I'd overheard had started to fade, replaced by the excitement of seeing my cousins and exploring the old house once more. When we arrived, everything seemed normal, just like it always was. The house was exactly as I remembered it, with its creaky floors, the faint smell of old wood and dust, and the familiar sounds of the neighborhood outside. The first day was just like any other visit. My cousins and I played games, ran around the garden, and explored the house from top to bottom. We laughed, joked, and even scared each other with silly ghost stories, none of which we really believed. But the next day, something happened that I still think about to this day. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was sitting on the stairs, just minding my own business while my mom and aunt chatted in the kitchen. The kitchen was the heart of the house, a warm, inviting space where the family often gathered. It was filled with the comforting smells of whatever my aunt was cooking, and the sounds of their conversation drifted through the open doorway. I was waiting for them to finish talking so we could all head out for a walk. The sun was shining outside, and I could see the garden through the large window at the end of the hallway. The flowers were in full bloom, and the air was filled with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass. It was the kind of day that made you feel like nothing bad could ever happen. At some point, my mom left the kitchen, probably to grab something from the living room. As she passed by me on the stairs, I saw her pause at the top. Her expression changed in an instant, her eyes widened in shock, and her face drained of color. She looked like she had seen something, or someone, that shouldn't have been there. Her eyes darted around, searching for whatever had caught her attention. But when she looked again, whatever she had seen was gone. The hallway was empty, just as it had been moments before. She didn't say anything to me at the time, just quickly brushed it off and hurried back to the kitchen, her face a little paler than before. It wasn't until years later that I asked her about that day. We were sitting in our living room, just the two of us, reminiscing about old times. The memory of that afternoon had stayed with me, and I couldn't resist asking her what had happened. She hesitated before answering, as if she was debating whether or not to tell me the truth. Finally, she admitted that she had seen a figure move across the top of the stairs. It had been just a fleeting glimpse, enough to make her heart skip a beat. But when she looked again, there was nothing there. It couldn't have been me or my cousins, we were all downstairs at the time. She said she had felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, the kind of feeling that tells you something is very, very wrong. But she didn't want to scare us, so she kept quiet about it. That wasn't the last time something strange happened in that house. A few months after the incident on the stairs, my brother and I had to sleep over at my aunt and uncle's house. My parents were out of town for a weekend, and my aunt and uncle offered to take care of us. I was excited at first. It meant more time with my cousins, more games, and more exploring. But as night fell, the excitement started to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. My brother and I shared a room on the second floor. The room was small, with just enough space for 2 twin beds, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the garden. At night, the garden looked different, darker, more ominous, as if the shadows were hiding something. The house, which had seemed so full of life during the day, now felt cold and empty. Neither of us could sleep that night. We tossed and turned in our beds, trying to find a comfortable position, but the sense of unease only grew. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant sound of the wind outside. It was as if the house itself was alive, watching and waiting for something to happen. We ended up talking to pass the time, whispering to each other about everything and nothing. We were just kids, trying to ignore the growing fear that seemed to fill the room. We talked about school, our friends, and the games we had played earlier that day. But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That's when we heard it. A sharp, loud shh that cut through the silence like a knife. It was so close, so startling, that we both froze. At first we thought it was my uncle, annoyed that we were still awake. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't right. The sound had come from much closer, almost right next to us. But there was no one there. Just the two of us, staring wide-eyed at each other in the dark. We didn't dare move. We didn't dare breathe. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper, and the silence more oppressive than ever before. We strained our ears, listening for any other sounds, but there was nothing. Just the distant ticking of a clock and the sound of our own breathing. Eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we fell into a restless sleep. But I never told my parents about it, and neither did my brother. That night changed how I felt about my aunt and uncle's house. I didn't want to go back after that. There was something in that house, something that didn't belong there. And it seemed like whatever it was getting bolder. As I grew older, the memories of those strange occurrences stayed with me. I tried to rationalize them, telling myself that it was just my imagination, that there was a logical explanation for everything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something in that house, something that defied explanation, something that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. Years have passed, and I still can't shake the feeling that there was something more to those incidents. Something that we couldn't see, but that was always there, watching us. My mom never liked talking about it, and neither did my aunt. But I know they remember it, just as clearly as I do. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if that little girl is still there, waiting for someone else to notice her. And that's the end of our story. Huge thanks to Auntie'S XZ for sharing this terrifying experience with us. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more creepy tales. Stay safe out there, and until next time, sweet dreams.